and welcome to Take Two, the show that looks at the issues behind the news. I'm Henshall. Today we have some news shorts you may have missed, and then I'll be talking to Roy Hunter, who's been researching the pros and cons of fluoride and its use in public water supplies. Finally, we have the second part of our interview with economist and financial expert Clive Menzies. NSA monitoring top echelon globally. The latest NSA leaks cast an even more sinister light on what the US, the UK and others are up to, and gives a new given a new meaning to the expression high-ranking target, which once meant an enemy. A secret NSA document dealing with the so-called high-ranking targets has provided further indications that Germany's Angela Merkel was indeed a target, but the new leaks make things much worse than thought up to now. The new leaked documents have been given to the German magazine Der Spiegel, and this is what they have concluded. First, the number of foreign politicians and decision makers subject to intense surveillance looks to be possibly in the thousands. The leaked list is reported to contain 122 country leaders. It's not unreasonable to suspect that if the targeting goes as far as the leaders of minor countries, it is likely to include many more besides the top leaders in key countries like Germany or Brazil. But it's far more than tapping Merkel's phone. According to the latest document, Angela Merkel has been placed in the so-called Target Knowledge Database, the central database of individual targets designed to analyse, quotes, complete profiles of target persons. The responsible NSA unit praises the automated, machine-driven administration of collected information about these high-value targets. One system, known as Nimrod, automatically collates information from intelligence agency reports, as well as transcripts of intercepted fax, voice and computer-to-computer communication. Currently, the database has around 200,000 targets, but this is set to increase, potentially massively, and fully automated systems will soon be coming online. The NSA estimates it should be able to manage more than 3 million entries along with their dossier. According to the leaked documents, the USA's secret FISA court, which issued the unconstitutional permissions to the Washington government to conduct mass surveillance, provided the NSA with authorization to monitor, quotes, Germany on March 7, 2013. It appears to place no restrictions at all. Does it really mean this? The NSA refuses to comment, but lawyers at the American Civil Liberties Union, contacted by Der Spiegel, believe it provides the NSA with permission to access the communication of all German citizens. Other countries known to be authorized for blanket surveillance include China, Mexico, Japan, Venezuela, Yemen, Brazil, Sudan, Guatemala, Bosnia and Russia. Wages set to go on falling. Real wages, i.e. adjusted for inflation, are still falling here in the UK, reports the Office for National Statistics. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, real earnings are not expected to return to their 2009-10 levels until 2018-19. Trade union leaders point out that since the 1980s, wage increases have become successively less, while productivity has continued to rise. Some would add that the difference has been pocketed by employers and the rich. Another factor the report failed to mention is that the cost of living index is skewed against the poorest, so that their cost of living has actually gone up faster than the overall figures suggest. And that's not counting the appalling house price bubble in the southeast of England. Here in the UK, a discreet report only in the business press as far as we can see details just how mean and illegal some employers can be. It concerns workers on the low-paid care industry. HMRC, the tax collecting agency, has announced that over 1 in 3 of the 224 employers they looked at were paying below the minimum wage, and this amounted to £340,000 in effectively stolen wages. Penalties totalled a mere £110,000. employers were charging employees for their own uniforms and making them pay for travel between visits to clients. Nations start to reject corporate rule. Are there grounds for optimism that the march of corporate rule, some would say corporate fascism, has been stopped? The issue is the so-called investment treaties. Ostensibly designed to create a level playing field, the effect of these treaties is to place by law secret tribunals and corporate interests above the state. So Germany is being sued by the chemical giant Bayer for banning harmful pesticides. Now Germany is reported to be objecting to the new transatlantic treaty known as TTIP by calling for the corporate sovereignty provisions to be excluded. South Africa has announced that it will not renew its version of the treaty, while according to the Yonhap news agency, South Korea wants to revisit the corporate sovereignty chapter in its trade agreement with the US. Now we have a report that Indonesia has informed the Netherlands that it too has decided to terminate the bilateral investment treaty between the two nations from the 1st of July 2015, following a case which threatens to cost the Indonesian taxpayer over $1 billion. Churchill Mining is arguing that Indonesian environmental regulations have cost it that much in lost profits. There seems to be something odd about a free market economics when it's easier to sue governments than earn a living honestly. The Indonesian report also states that the government there intends to terminate all of its 67 bilateral investment treaties. Well, now we've got Roy Hunter here in the studio. Roy, you've been looking into this issue of fluoridation of water. I see the powers that be are ramping up their push for more fluoridation of water, and they say that you know, it's justified to medicate everyone without their consent, because of the issue about teeth fillings, people, you know, having less teeth fillings needed if we all drink fluoridated water.
Well, that's always been the story, hasn't it? And you know, they've been fluoridating the water now for about 60 years, and that was always the thinking behind it. But you know, the science, as with a lot of these things, the science, you know, it just isn't there really. If we look into it, there's very few studies, particularly in this country or the States, that actually agree with the fluoridation, the science on fluoridation as it's presented to us. And there's 33 studies from China, Iran, India and Mexico, and they've all reported an association between fluoride exposure and reduced IQ. So I look at it personally, and always have really. I've been cutting my fluoride out now for many years, and I just see it as another part of the control system really. Public Health England are saying that there's 28, because in fluoridated areas there's 28% fewer 5-year-olds with cavities and 21% fewer 12-year-olds with cavities, and this stuff really only works for children. It's not really even supposed to work for adults. So,
oh really?
So they're medicating the whole population to you know, prevent a few cavities amongst children.
Right.
And in this country, at present, 11% of the country has fluoridated water, and now they're saying they want 40%. Of fluoridated water, but what they're also saying is that it's the poor people that have the bad dental health, and so what they want to do is fluoridate the poor areas.
Oh my goodness, you couldn't make it.
You couldn't, could you?
Okay, I mean, I'm right. No big, you know, paranoic, but it does look rather dodgy, doesn't it?
Yeah. So the reason I've looked at fluoride now is because just as the health authorities are trying to push this new fluoridation program, the Lancet have come out, and the Lancet is one of the most venerable medical journals, peer-reviewed medical journals going. They've just published research that now includes fluoride as one of the big industrial chemicals as a developmental neurotoxin, which means that although it's a toxin all over, it's particularly bad for developing fetuses and developing children and developing brains. So in 2006, they had named 5 industrial chemicals, and now 2014 they've introduced another 6. So we now have 12, and fluoride is now included as one of those. And they say neurodevelopment disabilities, including autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, and other cognitive impairments, affect millions of children worldwide, and some diagnoses seem to be increasing in frequency. Industrial chemicals that injure the developing brain are among the known causes for this rise in prevalence.
Wow. So that's pretty powerful. I mean, they're not presumably directly saying we shouldn't fluoridate water, because they wouldn't say anything.
No, they wouldn't say that.
But they're saying that as part of a cocktail
of industrial
chemicals, which are basically almost certainly causing mass damage to the population.
Yeah, and England's Chief Dental Officer Barry Cockcroft has said dental decay is far worse in poorer communities than affluent ones. Fluoridation reduces these inequalities. Academic studies continue to show that fluoridation is safe and cost effective. Over 200 million people drink fluoridated water in America, some now for over 60 years, with no ill effects on their health.
Well, there's an obvious potential logical fallacy there, because Americans' health is hardly exemplary.
No, absolutely.
And so how can he say that it has no ill effects on their health?
Absolutely. And also, I mean, it's a neurotoxin. This is what the Lancet's saying. It's a neurotoxin. And so then you have to look at America's mental health, and that's not too clever either. Yes, of course,
terrible.
And of course that mental health is part of that control system. That's how I feel about it, being part of the cognitive control.
Right.
Yeah.
You suspect that there are suspicions that the powers that be are sort of well aware that there is some sort of damage being done, and they're not unhappy about it.
Yeah. In the US, 64% of the population has fluoridated water. That's 276 million, but only 3% in Europe. So that's again another way that Europe is much safer than the US, but it is 11% in this country, which is quite worrying, and they want to increase it. But the side effects are arthritis, which is an overdose of fluoride gives you symptoms which are almost indistinguishable from arthritis.
Right. So that makes it logical to think that possibly in small doses it's contributing to arthritis.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. And a third of American adults have some form of arthritis.
Yeah.
Obesity, it gives obesity. So again, we can look at America and we can see a little bit of obesity there. Hypothyroidism, which gives apathy and depression, and pineal gland calcification, and certainly a lot of people on watching TPV, the People's Voice, will know all about the pineal gland, and some people think it's the third eye. And
what a very important control process.
And the problem with the pineal gland is because it sits between the two hemispheres of the brain, it's outside the blood-brain barrier. So that can be
it is very vulnerable to
damage.
How interesting.
Also, skeletal defects, premature puberty, which we're seeing increasingly, and sterility, which we're seeing increasingly. So all the stuff that we see going on with our health across the Western societies
is actually caused by larger doses of fluoride. So we're
fluoride is responsible for some of these things. Whether it's all produced by the fluoride, we don't know. And especially, if Europe's only 3%, and all these symptoms are being seen throughout Europe, so we can't blame it all on fluoride.
A lot of fluoride is causing these things. So it seems it's not unreasonable to think that small amounts in the water, because they do. That's their big argument, isn't it? That it's only tiny amounts, and we're all being much too paranoid. But the problem with cocktails is that tiny amounts all multiply with each other, don't they? I think I remember the Ecologist magazine's always mentioning this, how it's not the individual chemicals that promise the cocktail effect.
The Professor John Doole, who's chairman of the National Research Council review called Fluoride in Drinking Water, a review of the EPA standards.
That's in America,
Yeah. He's been quoted as saying, what the committee found is that we've gone with the status quo regarding fluoride for many years, for too long really, and now we need to take a fresh look. In the scientific community, people tend to think this is settled. I mean, when the US Surgeon General comes out and says this is one of the top one of the top 10 greatest achievements of the 20th century. That's a hard hurdle to get over. But when we look at the studies that have been done, we find that many of these questions are unsettled, and we have much less information than we should, considering how long this fluoridation process has been going on.
And that's the chairman of the National Research Council writing in Scientific American.
Yes.
So you can't get much more authoritative than that.
No.
That's just frightening, isn't
Although
it?
I expect he's probably been made redundant by now.
Lost his job.
Yeah.
So there are stories making the rounds that fluoride was put into the drinking water in Nazi concentration camps. Is there any evidence?
Looking into it, there is evidence for it, although not as much as I first assumed, actually, to be honest with you. US Air Force Major Jordan, talking to the Un-American Activities Committees, he said that they were shipping fluoride to Russia, and Russia was putting that in the drinking water of their concentration camps. And a guy called Charles Elliott Perkins, a research chemist worker, chemistry, biochemistry, physiology and pathology, was sent to take charge of the vast IG Farben works after the war.
Second World War, yeah.
And he says that they were putting it in the concentration camp water, and he says repeated doses of infinitesimal amounts of fluoride will in time reduce an individual's power to resist domination by slowly poisoning and narcoticizing a certain area of the brain, and will thus make him submissive to the will of those who wish to govern him. Both the Germans and the Russians added sodium fluoride to the drinking water of prisoners of war to make them stupid and docile.
Well, these are certainly big issues. Thanks very much, Roy.
Thank you.
Well, in our last programme, we had Clive Menzies from the Critical Thinking Project explaining how, really, with just 4 action points, so many of the world's problems could be solved. Well, this week we've got Clive back to speak about how we could possibly achieve the changes that are needed. So, Clive, give me some ideas.
Certainly. Well, I'll try. When I explained last time about the Critical Thinking Project, one of the things that we've been looking at is identifying levers for change, and I won't go through a lot of the process we went through. But if you look at activism over the last 5 decades or so, it's never failed to achieve anything radical and durable in terms of change. Yes, there have been improvements, certainly in ecology terms and environmental terms. There have been some successes. But if you look at where we are environmentally today, we're no better off in reality. We may have solved some problems, but we've created whole new ones. And one of the fundamental problems is that the powers that be, or those that have a vested interest in the status quo, feel no obligation to answer to challenges from those who are looking for change. The onus of proof rests with activists and those who want to change the world. And those who sit in positions of power, whether they be the ruling elites, the politicians, the media controlled by the ruling elites, they can ignore, they can suppress or just dismiss any challenges to the status quo. And they use a lot of clever techniques to do so through the media. We know how the media is conditioning thinking generally and one's worldview. And Robert Ashford and Rodney Shakespeare, they talk about a concept of fiduciary responsibility. And essentially what that means, anyone who is an agent or trustee has a responsibility to fulfill their obligations. And using the new model charter, what we want to do is to actually, in law, challenge the powers that be. It could be a government, it could be a corporation, it could be a regulator, it could be any one of those parties, and initially it would be governments, challenge them that they have failed to fulfill their fiduciary obligations, and they've been negligent and abusive in the process. And this is very much the germination of an idea, and we haven't yet taken legal advice, and we're looking for people to do so. But this concept is well established in Anglo-American jurisprudence. And what we, if you like, those seeking change, the plaintiffs, have to do is to submit pleadings to the court. And essentially what that is saying, we think we've been wronged, we've got the evidence to prove it, and we want to take the defendant, be it the government in this case, to court. The court is then obliged to get some sort of response from the defendant, in this case the government. So using the law, what we hope to be able to do is to force a response from those who are maintaining the status quo.
Aren't you a bit optimistic about the British judges?
Well, so much of the establishment has been captured by the ruling elites, and I'm sure that it will be, it's not a slam dunk. But I'm sure that somewhere in the world, somewhere in the UK, there are public-spirited lawyers, public-spirited judges who do recognise that we have a problem and are interested in getting to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
And not just in the UK, but this could be a movement or an idea that spreads globally. Right. Certainly in America, where you've got 47.5 million people on food stamps, for example. Yeah. I should think they'd be up for it.
Yeah.
And even if it couldn't get to court, in the same way that 9/11 has been tried in Toronto, it's been tried in Malaysia, or war crimes. People have been tried for war crimes in Malaysia. There may be jurisdictions in which this is taken up, and yes, it will be ignored by the mainstream media. But if it happens enough, and Occupy was a global movement. Let's face it; it was a spontaneous uprising across 1,000 cities. There is that latent anger there. If we can focus on the root of the system and say, this system is abusive, it's causing all these problems, and if we can do that globally, then we open the door up to a whole new range of possibilities in terms of how global activism actually succeeds in its objectives.
I suppose, you know, behind this thinking is the presumption that there will be feet on the ground, our feet on the ground outside their institutions, as there was with Occupy, that it'll take a bit of a pressure from below.
Yes, it will, but I also think you have to think about, if you like, what I regard as the lieutenants of the elites, and all the people who are in place implementing this abusive policy. They or their families, to varying degrees, are subject to the same forms of abuse. And so it has to be an idea that takes hold, not just among activists, but amongst people who may be beneficiaries of the system, but also victims of the system.
You can be both,
can't you? We're all both beneficiaries and victims.
Well, everybody here is, There's a few places in the world.
There are very few people who are purely victims.
Yes, even in an Indian village, there's a guy who's doing a bit better than somebody else.
But perversely, there are very few of the elites who aren't victims as well. Because, you know, they suffer their own traumas through this process of abuse.
Greed, addiction to money.
And some of them get thrown to the wolves. You know, you think about Ken Lay of Enroy got thrown to the wolves. You think about Guinness trial, the people that ended up in jail. You know, they have their own insecurities. That's why they fight so hard to hang on to what they've got, because they fear for their future, as most people do. If one can open up the possibility of a future where they don't feel threatened, then everybody benefits.
So the activists on the ground have got to cut down on the snarling and get a little bit more less threatening in a way.
I think anger has a place, and I'm not sure that I'm saying that people should muzzle their protest, but I think one should focus the protest much more forensically on causes rather than symptoms, because it's so easy to set one faction off against the other. You know, you take the bedroom tax. How divisive is that? There's those who think benefit scroungers. So you get the employed and the unemployed. Then you get migrants and indigenous populations. You know, there's a constant game of division that is played by the elites and those in power to keep us all ignorant and stop us joining together. Somebody wrote to me the other day, he produces something called the Runnymede Gazette, which has some interest, Frank Taylor, and he said, it's very simple. All we've got to do is get together. You know, there are 7 billion of us on this planet. And you don't need 7 billion to get together. It was Margaret Mead who said, never underestimate the power of a small number of individuals to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
And there's ideas, and there's a saying about there's nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. There's
Exactly.
another phrase.
And the alternative is rather dire. You know, here we are looking into the jaws of a World War III, potentially, as tensions escalate over Ukraine, where the economic collapse, when it comes, where are we going to get the bailout money from?
Yeah.
You know, the system is broken.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think the time has come.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Clive. I think that just about wraps that up for now. And I'd be delighted if you'd come back again and comment on some of our day-to-day issues in the light of these basic principles in the future.
Do what I can.
Thanks very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's the end of this episode of Take Two. Thanks very much for watching, and thanks to The People's Voice for hosting us. You can watch all of our shows again on our RADTV UK YouTube channel.